In this lecture, we're going to look at the French Revolution, takes place over a 10-year period from 1789 to 1799. Before we begin looking at the causes of the French Revolution, I wanted to take a moment to point out the very iconic image, the painting here from Eugene Delacroix from 1833, which is Liberty Guiding the People. If you notice in here, you have the French version of Lady Liberty holding the flag, charging across what looks to be barricades and heading towards the viewer, accompanied by all sorts of people from various walks of life. You have on the right image side of the image there, you see a young boy who looks to be some sort of messenger who's carrying pistols. You have an individual in a top hat there, the idea being that that person perhaps is bourgeoisie, middle class. You have what appears to possibly also a sailor as well to the left, as well as all of these other individuals there. And the idea is that the French Revolution here was supposed to espouse these notions that you see listed at the top of the slide: liberty, equality, fraternity. So all of these individuals and classes working together, obviously this way violently, working together to try to achieve those goals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But how do we go from having what had been essentially an absolutist monarchy that we had looked at in a previous lecture, how do we go from that to a revolution that initially sets up a constitution and then ultimately sets up something radically different? Well, part of it is looking at some of the base causes of the French Revolution, and one of the main ones has to do with taxes and debt. France in 1789 was massively in debt, mainly because of its involvement in the U.S. War of Independence, where France had funded the Americans, the colonists, in their fight against the British. Not necessarily because the monarchy favored the independence movement, but mainly because they hated Britain. There was also, though, as you remember from the previous lecture, the courtly lifestyle that had been begun under Louis XIV had been incredibly expensive to maintain. So a lot of money had either gone out of the country to help the colonists in America, or was being used for a lot of what a lot of people thought were frivolous royal notions. Now, the nobles and the clergy were a problem in this system because even though they owned the majority of the land in the country, they were mostly exempt from taxes. And in the case of France, the people who paid the most in taxes were the peasants. Peasants had to pay royal taxes, they had to pay tithes to the church, they had to pay landlord dues because there was still a feudal system in place. In addition to that, they also had to pay rents on their land. So the peasants are taxed the most, although the next highest taxed class of individuals were the bourgeoisie, the middle class, urban city dwellers. And you can see this notion of exemptions and the problems that they cause in this French political cartoon from 1789. What we have in here is we have three individuals writing another individual there. And so if you look carefully, the first individual, who was a rather overweight gentleman carrying a whip, it might be hard to see on your image, but he has a document right up near his face that actually in French says feudalism. So it is an indication that this person is a feudal lord. The person above him with the hat and the robe is holding some documents that talk about the clergy and Inquisition. So this is a member of the church. So both of these individuals, nobles and the clergy, have exemptions. In the back there, actually, with what appears to be the wig and black robes with white collar, is a judge. These individuals were also elites and also mostly exempt from taxes. But the idea was that these individuals controlled the courts and all of the laws, and everyone else simply had to abide by it. And naturally, from everyone else's perspective, they tailored the laws to their own needs. So you have all of these individuals who do not appear to be wanting for food in any way, shape, or form, riding this very skinny, emaciated, chained, bridled, and blindfolded individual who is supposed to represent the sort of the average Frenchman, the peasant. Notice that, I mean, he's gaunt, he has no clothes, He's blindfolded, he's being led with a bridle. And so all of these things in this image then are meant to show how these individuals quite literally are riding the backs of, or living their lives on the backs of the lower class French. And so this reflected a sentiment that was common in France and would drive people to despise those in these positions of power because they weren't contributing the amount that they should to the continuance of the country. Now, to get a sense of how these issues faced the French, one of those aspects is to look at these other economic problems, particularly in terms of food. What you have here are two different charts that talk about the price of wheat. One is the price of wheat in France, and the other is the price of wheat in Paris in the years leading up to the French Revolution. The reason we point something out like this is because wheat is a staple of the diet. Obviously, it's used to make bread. And because it's such a staple, the higher the prices for this, the harder it is for people to get basic needs met in terms of food. On the left here, this chart beginning in about 1730 or so works its way all the way up to 1790, and what it is it's showing the average price of approximately 100 liters of wheat in France. And you'll notice that there are a series of spikes and dips in it. Between 1730 and 1750 it goes up. That's francs on the side there, so it goes up to 20, or almost up to 20, about 15, and then all the way down below 10, and then back up, and then down a little bit. But as you can notice, the overall trend between 1730 and 1790 is upwards. There are obviously some dips in there, but it seems to just slowly creep up if you were to hit all of the peaks of there. And then if you notice that in about 1789, it is not the highest it has been just prior to that large spike, but the large spike that occurs there right before 1790, which is 1789 and the Revolution. That large spike indicates a massive increase and the highest increase in bread, so that by that point it is more than twice as much than it was approximately 60 years prior to that. You can see it even better in the image on the right here, where you have the price for 100 kilograms of wheat in the city of Paris. And from 1770, with one sort of or two small exceptions in 1775 and about 1782, for the most part, the prices work their way down to, and then averaging about 20 francs or so. But then you notice just before 1789 that it spikes again. And so what this meant is that people were spending more and more of their money on basic items, and this is going to cause a lot of unrest because these people are going hungry. Add to this the idea that unemployment is down because of a textile slump, bad weather had damaged harvests, of course these bread prices are up. What does this mean in terms of those figures in terms of daily wage and sort of living? And what you see in this chart here is you have a list of occupations on the left that go from those who make the least amount of money to the most amount of money. So a laborer who is making roughly 15 sous a day, you see on the left there at the top. Next is a builder's laborer. They make 18, journeyman mason 24, journeyman locksmith 30, and then a sculptor 60. Now, what the figures are, the other two columns on the right there, is how much they would spend on bread as a percentage of their income. So an individual who's a laborer who makes 15 sous a day in 1788 would spend 60% of their income on bread. So 60% of their income on bread. In 1789, a year later, it has skyrocketed to 97%. That means that they spend 97% of their money, right, just on bread. That leaves 3% for everything else. If you see that the builder's laborer in 1788 spends 50%, that jumps in 1789 to 80%, leaving only 20%. The journeyman's mason likewise has a jump, although not as drastic. 37% of his money spent on bread, that jumps to 60%. And if you go to the sculptor at the bottom, and the idea here is that we're looking at people from the lower classes all the way up to the higher classes. By the time you get to the higher classes, they only spend 15% of their income on bread in 1788. And during the economic crisis of 1789, it only jumps to 24%, which is only a 9% jump, which leaves them roughly 75% of their income for other things. So the idea here is that you would find that those in the lower levels of society, the lower classes, are going to be the hardest hit because they're spending the higher percentage of their income in order to buy bread. So they might be the ones most likely. So the lower classes, the lower middle class, and middle class would be the ones most likely to feel this pinch, and also might be most likely the ones to be involved in revolution. So if we look at the causes, and we have exemptions in terms of taxes, we have these economic problems, especially in terms of the amount of money spent on bread. One of the things you should bear in mind is that in the period prior to this that you've read about in your textbook, we've had a growth of a middle class. Now, middle class means that they do not have to labor as much as the lower classes. They don't have as much leisure time as the upper classes, but there is a middle class who does have a somewhat set of money in order to have a bit of leisure time. That is important because of the spread of Enlightenment ideas, which you've also read about. And so these Enlightenment ideas are ideas about issues about equality, but also especially issues regarding fixing the things that they see going on in society around them. There'd been a number of revolutions in the 1770s and 80s based on Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality. So, for example, the United States, Netherlands, Belgium, Poland. Of course, the United States is especially influential because the French had supported the Americans against the British. So all of these things come together, all these notion of Enlightenment ideas, they all come together and in 1789 during the French Revolution. Now your textbook is going to talk about these, the timeline itself and go into more detail. I'm going to try to give you a basic sort of overview because I want to hit a couple important themes that take place. The first thing to note is that why this begins in 1789 as well, and why it starts off as something that is much more middle class in its origins, is that in 1789, King Louis XVI had wanted to reform the tax code, and he actually tried to get it so that the church and the nobles would pay more. That didn't really work. And so he had to call the Estates General, which is the legislature, which had not been called in 175 years. The Estates General, as you remember from your reading, is composed of three groups. The first estate is the clergy. That's probably around 100,000 or so individuals. The second estate is the nobility. That's anywhere from about 250,000 to 400,000. Then there's the third estate, which basically represents the rest of the nation, about 27 million. So you can already see that this is a little bit biased in terms of voting for who might have more sway. The third estate's dominated by the middle class, which is roughly about 2.3 million or so. The problem here is that the way that voting works was done by the body. That means that the first estate votes as a chunk, the second estate votes as a chunk, the third estate votes as a chunk. So there's just three votes. That means that the two smallest portions of society, the nobility and the clergy, can essentially determine all legislation without the majority of the people, those of the third estate, having really a say. The third estate had demanded voting by head. That is, they wanted essentially one man, one vote. And this way they could hopefully at least tie. What happened, though, is that ultimately, in what we refer to as the bourgeois revolt, the third estate, so this estate that represented everyone, which is led by the middle class. The bourgeoisie here is just simply the term for usually the urban middle class, educated urban middle class. So the bourgeoisie are part of the revolt of the third estate. And what they essentially do is because they actually got locked out of the meeting originally that was being held, so they just went next door into what's known as a tennis court, and they decide to declare a national assembly. In June of 1789, they say that we're just going to create a new legislative group, the National Assembly. So in June, this originates, and everyone would vote by head, so it would be one man, one vote. And the emphasis for this new movement is very much one man, one vote. They were not giving the vote to women. Very shortly after that, they take what's known as the tennis court oath. These new members of the National Assembly take the tennis court oath, which is they vow that they will not disband until they had created a constitution for France. Now, at this point, it's important to remember that it's still mostly legal what they're doing. It's also predominantly nonviolent, and it's also a bourgeois revolt. So this is the middle class that is doing it, which you can see in the image below there, the sort of sketch of the tennis court oath where they come together, and also members of the other two estates, seeing where the momentum was going. Many of them decided to skip out on the original Estates General and come over and join, which is what you see taking place down below.